If it's the case that we find ourselves in a circumstance in which people who are supposed to be high quality thinkers are not doing a very good job, and we're pointing out maybe there are big errors over here, big errors over there. We haven't gone into the history. Maybe we can do that at some other point. It's a very rich history here of spectacular errors being made and held on to for long periods of time, and then only, science only progressing, as they say, coffin by coffin.
Funeral by funeral, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So, okay, here's a claim. There are discoverable patterns of error that are apparent across disciplines, and they have something in common. There's a particular way of thinking that I'm starting to see crop up across disciplines that is so universal, it makes me think something like we're in a dark age. And I would describe it as, it's a simple way is saying is underestimating the complexity of the world. Mm-hmm. But there's something more technical going on here, which is the process of information loss when people are thinking about complex phenomena. Let me give you an example that is recently researching, and I think you'll find this interesting. Okay, this is so funny, Brett. So in the mid-1980s, there was this paper that was published. I forget who the author was, and it was supposed to demonstrate that the supposed hot hand in sports was a fallacy. There was a mistake. It's widespread cognitive misfiring. There is no such thing as the hot hand or getting in the zone. This even made it into Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Yep. This was like, wow, a triumph of statistics and math and analysis over what these unsophisticated practitioners believe, which is that you can get in the zone and there is such a thing as a hot hand. So for multiple decades, the hot hand fallacy was held up as an example of the superiority of, let's call it mathematical data analysis over other techniques. Okay. Turns out that idea that there is a hot hand fallacy, which is thinking that by looking at the data and the way that they looked at the data, they could arrive at a conclusion that turns out to be incorrect for a few reasons. I'll give you a couple of simple examples. So the way that they try to conclude that there is no such thing as the hot hand is by looking at streaks of performance in player performance. I think it was the person analyzed like 1 year of the Boston Celtics in basketball and was trying to say, do we see evidence that there are streaks, or is it fairly random and there is no streaking taking place? So they did the analysis and they said, oh, well, we looked at the data, which is, of course, the important thing to do. You look at the data and you draw the conclusion, I see no evidence of streaks. Therefore, it's a widespread cognitive illusion. Well, okay, it turns out they didn't take into account that defenses in basketball will adjust their behavior based on the performance of the person who's streaking. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the data and you don't see a change, you see the same pattern despite the defense changing its, it's double teaming somebody that it wouldn't otherwise do. That means the person is streaking. You're looking at the same data, but you're going, oh, no, that's actually evidence that there is a streak. There are other mistakes that are made. This is just in the past, 10 years, there's a bunch of research coming out saying, oh, by the way, the hot hand is a thing. All of those unsophisticated sports people, everybody in the domain of sports who has done anything physical will understand that getting in the zone is a thing. All of sports psychology is about getting in the zone. And yet here you have these academics going, oh, you don't understand. You don't understand the sophisticated mathematics involved. Okay. So anyways, I bring that up. Turns out they were wrong. This is a gigantic embarrassment. People should be embarrassed. It looks like they might have even made statistical errors themselves. Not only was their data mistaken, but they might have essentially made a mistake, a justifiable mistake because of something called the Monty Hall paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with. Of course. It's a very extremely unintuitive result in statistics.
It's anti-intuitive.
It's anti-intuitive, though there are pretty good examples. Once you get the concept, it sort of makes sense of what's going on. But the first time you encounter it, you're going to go, this is obviously something is broken here. Anyway, it looks like they sort of might have made a similar error, a subtle error in the paper that was published in 1985. Anyway, so their data is bad quality. They didn't take into account how defenses adjust. They might have made statistical errors, and they didn't account for like shot placement, where you were on the court. You know, if you've got a streak and you're like making layups versus you're an inch inside the 3-point line, you're going to just lump those into the same thing and then draw like that. Right. That's silly. Okay, so anyway, I bring that up to say this is the essence of the pattern that keeps happening over and over and over. It is people trying to do math in systems that are so complex, they do not lend themselves to the doing of math. Why? Because there is information loss. There are critical variables that people are not taking into account when they try to do the math. They try to look at the data. They think the data speaks for itself. It does not. If you're not taking into account shot placement, defensive strategy, whether or not the offensive psychology has changed, like there's a whole basket of complex things here that you're not taking into account. So the result is information loss. So actually on this note, apparently some of this new evidence that's coming out on hot hand research is showing in a bunch of different domains. Yeah, of course, the hot hand is a thing. Like no shocker there. It didn't take 30 years of academic theorizing to figure that out. One of the approaches to discovering this is by more advanced statistics, where they take into account things like shot placement. And when you take that variable into account, you go, oh, okay, well, I guess my conclusions didn't follow from my simplistic assumptions. It is that pattern, Bret, that pattern of information loss from abstraction errors that is absolutely everywhere. It's in math itself. It's in physics. It comes up in COVID related situations. If I were to say to you, Bret, don't you know there is a graph, an exponential chart of COVID infections, that means X, Y, and Z. And didn't you see the mathematical model that the guy in Oxford came up with? It's all the same type of error, simplistic model of reality, because you have less information that you're putting into your models than is out there in the world.
Yeah, so many different places we could go from here. But yes, I totally resonate with this interpretation. And I think there's, as you may well think, there's more to it. I mean, for one thing, the economic incentives actually foster people not to discover this error, because it basically creates a landscape of work to be done that can be remunerated.
Yep.
But this thing is set in motion. And in fact, in your dark age piece, you say something that's very close to something that I often say. You talk about the tendency to oversimplify. Mm-hmm. And what I would argue is that part of what is going wrong and why we are so stuck is we made our early gains scientifically in the simple fields. And that creates a problem, because what it does is it causes you to think the rules of science are the rules of science that work for simple fields.
And what simple fields are you talking about?
Chemistry and physics.
Right. Which is unintuitive if people don't. Like, usually I think people think physics is the most complex. It's not.
It may be the hardest cognitively, but it's the simplest stuff. It's just very foreign from our experience.
You can control for the most variables.
Right. So we made our early gains there, and then we went, now we know how to do science. And when you apply those rules to biology, for example, it's a no-go, because the complexity makes those rules laughable, right?
Yeah.
And we are not good at correcting for it. So we haven't updated science. The other thing, there's something I haven't heard you mention, which is that, and again, at the level of the interface between our scientific practice and the incentives surrounding it. We make this mistake, which I swear causes any field to bog down. And the mistake, first of all, I would argue that diminishing returns, important concepts often get mislabeled because they get very closely associated with the first place that they were spotted. So I would argue diminishing marginal returns is one of the most important complex systems concepts in the universe, and that it's overly associated with economics, which is the first place it was seen, ironically, because economics is simple enough to see it, right? And the point is, diminishing returns ought to afflict any system that has two characteristics: complexity and an objective. So there's no diminishing returns in a hurricane. There's complexity, but there's no objective, right? But if you've got an objective against which to define something like a return and complexity, you'll see diminishing returns. So here's my point. Let's say you've got a field X. Somebody comes up with an insight in field X that's really important, right? The next important thing has been discovered. A flurry of work happens that's all very productive, okay? This causes the field to decide that that insight is fundamental, and to award the school of thought that owns that insight all of the resources, because the return on investment is so big, right? Who else would you give them to? These are the people who have the hot hands, right? Okay, now you've given all of the resources to the school of thought that had this insight. That insight is going to peter out. It's going to hit diminishing returns. That school of thought is now the only game in town. Every other school of thought dies off. Nobody remembers how to do it. And eventually, the school of thought hits a plateau. And the point is, well, we're just going to keep doubling down because we know we're right, because look how productive we've been, right? And the point is, no, you should never have edited down to one school of thought, right? At the very least, yes, you would be slower when the flurry of progress is happening. You'd be slower if you had at least two schools of thought live. But at the point that your school of thought peters out, you need the next most promising school of thought to tell you what to do next. And we never do this. So every field is almost always stuck, right?
There's an immediate analogy here to the process of thinking critically. If you have not arrived at the truth and you have plausible theory A that is totally incommensurate with plausible theory B, just because you're preferring A now doesn't mean you throw B away, or C or D. You go, okay, well, maybe there are maybe there are concepts in the different theories that are going to piece together the thing I'm missing in the dominant theory. And that's sort of the same thing that you're describing here, just at like an institutional level.
At an individual level. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I would argue I hope this doesn't sound like bragging, but one of the things that I think I do lots of stuff badly, but one of the things I think I do best.
You're an ape, Bret. Don't worry.
I am extremely patient if I don't know the answer to a question, right? I can take a question and I can file it in an incomplete state and I can wait a decade.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to do that, because if you feel pressure and you take the closest thing you've got to an answer and you force it to be an answer, then you end up missing the answer when you finally have enough pieces of the puzzle to get it right. You don't even know you're still asking, right? You think you knew the answer, and so you reject the real answer. And so anyway, it's like two schools of thought in your mind. And I literally believe that being of two minds is downstream, that consciousness evolved to allow two people to pool cognitive resources, but that as a secondary effect, the ability for one person to do it with themselves is a secondary adaptation.